Hello everyone, and welcome to the English Globe. Today, we are going to talk about something very important, the situation between Iran and Israel. This is a big topic in the news, and we will help you understand it using clear and simple English. So don't worry if you are just starting to learn.
Yes, this conflict is not easy to understand because it has a long history. But in this episode, we will explain everything step by step. We will use slow speech, clear vocabulary, and simple grammar to help you follow along easily. Our goal is to help you learn English and understand the world better at the same time.
It's important to say that we are not here to take sides. This podcast is neutral. We are not saying who is right or who is wrong. We only want to give you the facts in a respectful way. The conflict between Iran and Israel is serious, and many people feel strong emotions about it.
We believe learning English through real-world topics can help you grow faster. You'll not only learn new words and phrases, but you'll also become more confident talking about news and world issues. That's why today's topic is a perfect chance to learn English in a smart and useful way.
So what will we cover in this podcast? First, we will explain the history between Iran and Israel. Then, we'll talk about the events that made the tension worse. After that, we'll look at Iran's nuclear program and what's happening now in 2024 and 2025. We'll finish with vocabulary and a simple summary.
This episode is great for beginner and intermediate learners. You can listen as many times as you like. Pause and repeat if needed. Try writing down new words in a notebook and saying them out loud. That will help your memory and improve your pronunciation.
And if you enjoy this kind of podcast, please give this video a like. It helps more people find our channel. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the English Globe for more English learning episodes like this. We cover real topics, slow English, and useful vocabulary for your daily practice.
That's right. We are so happy to have you with us today. Thank you for spending your time learning with us. Now, let's begin our journey into understanding the situation between Iran and Israel, starting with the history of their relationship and how the tension first began.
To understand the tension between Iran and Israel, we first have to go back in time to understand the history of their relationship, which might surprise many people because at one time, Iran and Israel were not enemies at all. In fact, before 1979, Iran actually had diplomatic ties with Israel and even did business with them, and both countries shared certain interests, especially during the time when Iran was ruled by a king called the Shah, who had strong connections with the West and wanted his country to become more modern and open to the world.
Yes, Adam, that's a very important point to start with. Before the Iranian Revolution in 1979, Iran was one of the few Muslim-majority countries in the Middle East that had a working relationship with Israel. And this was because the government at that time, led by the Shah of Iran, saw Israel not as an enemy, but as a partner in economic and military matters, which meant they exchanged goods, shared information, and even supported each other secretly in some cases, despite the fact that most of the Arab world was already against Israel because of the ongoing conflict between Israel and the Palestinians.
But everything changed in 1979, when a major revolution happened in Iran, and the people of Iran overthrew the Shah and replaced his rule with a new Islamic government, led by a religious leader named Ayatollah Khomeini, who believed that Iran should no longer follow the ideas of the West and instead return to strong Islamic values. And from the very beginning, this new government was very clear in its position. It saw Israel not only as a political enemy, but as a moral and religious threat that should not exist in the region at all.
That's exactly right. The new Iranian leaders started calling Israel the Zionist regime and began speaking out very strongly against it in every speech and international meeting, saying that Israel was occupying Palestinian land and that it had no right to be there. And from that moment on, Iran stopped all relations with Israel and began to support groups that were fighting against it. And this created a deep and dangerous hostility that continues to grow even today, more than 40 years after the revolution.
So, to make it simple for our listeners, before 1979, Iran and Israel had a working relationship, but after the Islamic Revolution, Iran changed its government and its ideology completely, and since then, Iran has not only refused to recognize Israel as a country, but it has also made it a central part of its foreign policy to oppose Israel in every way, from speeches and protests to support for armed groups that also want to destroy Israel, which we will talk about more in the next sections.
This history is very important because it shows us that the Iran-Israel conflict is not only about politics or land, it's also about beliefs, values, and ideologies. And that makes it much harder to solve through normal diplomatic talks, because when two countries see each other, not just as rivals but as enemies of their values and identity, it becomes much more difficult to find peace or even to sit at the same table to talk. And that's one of the main reasons why this conflict has lasted so long.
Another important detail to mention here is that Iran sees itself as a leader in the Muslim world, especially among Shia Muslims, and part of that leadership includes standing up for the Palestinian cause, which means Iran sees Israel as a country that is oppressing Muslims, and they feel it is their religious and moral duty to fight against it, not just with words, but with money, weapons, and support to groups that are in direct conflict with Israel, which has led to many small and large clashes over the years.
And from Israel's point of view, the rise of the Islamic Republic of Iran was a big and dangerous shift in the region, because now there was a powerful country in the Middle East that openly wanted to destroy Israel and had the resources to support enemies that were right next to Israel's borders. So naturally, Israel saw this not just as a political challenge, but as a serious security threat. And over time, this fear grew stronger as Iran became more active in countries like Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza.
So when people ask why Iran and Israel are in conflict today, they often think it's something recent, but the truth is that the roots of this conflict go back more than 40 years, and they are connected to big changes in leadership, religious beliefs, and national goals. And unless we understand how all of this began, it's very hard to understand what is happening now. And that's why history is not just interesting, but necessary when we want to learn about international problems like this one.
In the next part of this podcast, we'll look at the key events that made the situation even worse. Military actions, attacks, and decisions made by both sides that pushed Iran and Israel further apart. And we'll also begin to explain how Iran started helping certain groups in the Middle East that are fighting against Israel, and why this support has become one of the most dangerous parts of the whole conflict. But before we go, we want to remind you of something very important.
Yes, if you're enjoying this podcast and learning something new, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The English Globe. Your support helps us create more useful English learning content on real-world topics. And if you want to help others understand this topic too, feel free to share the episode with your friends who are also learning English. Now that we understand how the tension between Iran and Israel began after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, it's time to talk about the major events that made the conflict even more serious over the past few decades. These events include military operations, political decisions, and support for armed groups, and each event added more stress and danger to the relationship between the two countries. Some of these moments were quiet and happened behind the scenes, while others were very public and shocked the world, but together they have created a situation where both Iran and Israel see each other as long-term enemies.
One of the first major developments was Iran's support for Hezbollah, a powerful armed group in Lebanon that was formed in the 1980s. Hezbollah is a Shia Muslim group that receives weapons, training, and money from Iran, and its main goal is to fight against Israel and remove its presence from the region. This group has been involved in many deadly battles with Israel, especially in southern Lebanon, and Israel considers Hezbollah to be one of the biggest threats to its security. For Iran, supporting Hezbollah is not only a way to help its allies, but also a way to stay close to Israel's northern border and keep pressure on the country without directly attacking it.
Another major event was the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah, which lasted for over a month and caused massive destruction, especially in Lebanon. During this war, thousands of rockets were fired into Israel, and Israel responded with strong airstrikes and ground attacks. Even though the war ended without a clear winner, it showed the world that Iran-backed groups like Hezbollah could create serious problems for Israel. This war made Israel more focused on stopping Iran's influence in the region, and it began to plan military and intelligence operations to weaken Iran's power, especially its support for other armed groups.
In addition to Lebanon, Iran also began supporting groups in the Palestinian territories, especially in Gaza, where the group Hamas is based. Like Hezbollah, Hamas is strongly against Israel and has received support from Iran to help it grow stronger and more dangerous. Iran gave Hamas the tools to build rockets and tunnels, which have been used in many attacks against Israel. Whenever there is violence between Israel and Gaza, Iran is often blamed for helping to make the situation worse. This ongoing support for groups that fight Israel has made the relationship between the two countries even more hostile and difficult to repair.
Another important event in this conflict was Israel's decision to begin targeting Iranian military forces in Syria. After the Syrian civil war began in 2011, Iran sent its military forces and advisors to support the Syrian government, and over time, Iran built military bases and moved weapons closer to Israel's border. In response, Israel launched hundreds of airstrikes on Iranian positions in Syria to stop weapons from reaching Hezbollah and to prevent Iran from becoming too strong in the area. These strikes happened many times, and although Iran did not always respond, they added more danger to the situation and increased the risk of a wider war.
But perhaps the most serious part of the Iran-Israel conflict is Iran's nuclear program, which we will discuss in more detail in the next section. Israel believes that Iran is trying to build nuclear weapons, and this has made the situation much more dangerous. In fact, Israel has taken secret actions to stop Iran's progress, including cyber attacks and the assassination of key scientists. One well-known attack was the Stuxnet cyber attack in 2010, which damaged Iran's nuclear equipment and slowed down its program. Israel has also been linked to attacks on nuclear sites and important people inside Iran, which has caused Iran to become even more determined to continue its program.
One shocking moment happened in 2020 when Iran's top nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, was assassinated in Tehran. Iran blamed Israel for the attack, and many international experts believed that Israel was behind it. This event made global headlines and increased the tension between the two countries. Iran promised to take revenge, and many people feared that this could lead to direct military conflict. Events like this show that the conflict is not just political, it also involves secret operations, spies, and attacks that happen quietly, but can have major effects on the safety of the region.
All of these events, the rise of Hezbollah, the 2006 war, Iran's support for Hamas, Israel's airstrikes in Syria, cyber attacks, and assassinations, have created a long list of reasons why Iran and Israel do not trust each other and remain in conflict. Every time one side takes action, the other side becomes more defensive and responds in ways that make things even worse. It's a cycle of fear, anger, and violence that continues year after year. Both countries feel that they must protect themselves, and this belief pushes them to take aggressive steps, even if those steps bring them closer to war.
What makes this situation more dangerous is that many of these actions happen in secret, and there are very few direct talks between Iran and Israel. They do not have embassies or meetings, and they mostly talk about each other through threats and warnings in the media. This means that misunderstandings can happen easily, and if one side makes a mistake, it could lead to a bigger war that no one really wants. That's why the world watches this conflict very closely. because what happens between Iran and Israel can affect the whole Middle East and even countries far away.
In the next section, we'll take a closer look at Iran's nuclear program, which is one of the most serious and complex parts of this conflict. We'll explain what Iran says about its program, what Israel believes, and how this issue has become a major source of fear and disagreement, not just between Iran and Israel, but also between Iran and the rest of the world. But before we move on, we'd like to remind our listeners of something important.
Yes. If you're finding this podcast helpful, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The English Globe. We work hard to bring you high-quality English content on real topics that matter. When you support us with a like or a comment, it helps more learners like you discover our channel and join our growing community. We truly appreciate every listener who takes this journey with us.
One of the most important and controversial parts of the Iran-Israel conflict is Iran's nuclear program, which many countries around the world, especially Israel, believe could lead to the development of nuclear weapons in the future. Iran, on the other hand, insists that its nuclear activities are peaceful and meant only for generating electricity, conducting scientific research, and treating medical patients through nuclear medicine. This disagreement about the true purpose of Iran's program has created serious tensions not only between Iran and Israel, but also between Iran and other world powers, leading to years of diplomatic efforts, deals, and even threats of war.
The story of Iran's nuclear program began in the 1950s with support from the United States during a time when the two countries were allies, but after the 1979 revolution, the program slowed down and became more secretive. Over the years, Iran started building nuclear facilities and enriching uranium, which is a process that can be used either for peaceful purposes like powering nuclear reactors or for making the core of a nuclear bomb, depending on the level of enrichment. Iran has always claimed that it has no intention of building a nuclear weapon, but its lack of transparency in the early 2000s made many countries suspicious, especially Israel, which sees a nuclear-armed Iran as an unacceptable threat to its very survival.
In response to the concerns about Iran's nuclear program, world powers including the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, and China entered into negotiations with Iran that eventually led to the 2015 agreement known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or simply the Iran nuclear deal. According to this deal, Iran agreed to limit its nuclear activities, reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium, and allow international inspectors from the United Nations to monitor its facilities in exchange for relief from the economic sanctions that had been hurting its economy. For a while, the deal seemed to be working, and there was hope that tensions in the region might decrease.
However, things changed dramatically in 2018 when the United States, under President Donald Trump, decided to withdraw from the nuclear deal and reimpose strict sanctions on Iran, claiming that the agreement was not strong enough to stop Iran from building a nuclear bomb in the future. This decision caused a major shift in the situation, and Iran began to slowly stop following parts of the deal, enriching uranium to higher levels and installing more advanced centrifuges that could speed up the process. Although Iran said it was only reacting to the U.S. withdrawal and still did not want to make a nuclear weapon, many countries began to worry that Iran was getting closer to having the ability to do so if it ever made the decision.
Israel has been the loudest voice warning the world about Iran's nuclear progress, and it believes that Iran is secretly working toward building a bomb despite its promises. Israeli leaders have said many times that they will never allow Iran to become a nuclear-armed country, and they are prepared to take military action if needed to prevent it. In fact, Israel has already taken several steps to slow down Iran's program, including cyber attacks like the Stuxnet virus that damaged Iran's nuclear equipment, and covert operations to assassinate Iranian scientists and destroy important facilities. These actions have added even more tension to an already dangerous relationship and increased the risk of a direct military conflict.
What makes this situation even more complicated is that there is no easy way to know what Iran's true intentions are. Because while the country continues to say it does not want nuclear weapons, it is also reducing cooperation with international inspectors and refusing to provide clear answers about some of its past nuclear activities. This lack of openness has made it harder for the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, the UN body that monitors nuclear programs, to confirm exactly what Iran is doing, which in turn fuels more suspicion and fear from Israel and other countries. In some ways, it has become a game of trust where each side accuses the other of lying or hiding something.
At the same time, there are people in both Iran and Israel who believe that the growing tension over the nuclear issue could be solved through diplomacy instead of war. And they argue that a return to negotiations and a new, stronger nuclear agreement could reduce the risk of conflict. These voices say that military attacks might only delay Iran's program for a short time while causing more violence and instability in the region. However, reaching a new deal is not easy, especially because there is a lot of mistrust and both sides have strong reasons to doubt each other's promises. The political situation inside both countries, as well as pressure from allies and enemies, makes it very hard for leaders to take risks or show flexibility.
So now we are in a situation where Iran is continuing to expand its nuclear program beyond the limits of the old deal, and Israel is becoming more worried and more aggressive in its actions to stop it. Many experts say that Iran is only a few months away from having enough highly enriched uranium to build a bomb if it chooses to, although building an actual weapon would still take more time and testing. Still, the fear that Iran might one day surprise the world with a nuclear test has created a sense of urgency among Israeli leaders and other world powers who are trying to decide what to do next. The world is watching closely, hoping that things don't move toward a dangerous confrontation.
It's important to understand that this issue is not just about two countries. It affects the whole region, and even the entire world. If Iran were to get nuclear weapons, other countries in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, might try to get them too, and that could start a new arms race that would make the region much more unstable. On the other hand, if Israel attacks Iran's nuclear sites, it could lead to a larger war that draws in Hezbollah, Hamas, and other Iran-backed groups, and this would cause a major crisis that could take years to recover from. That's why so many people around the world are urging both sides to avoid violence and find a peaceful solution.
In the next section of our podcast, we'll look closely at how other countries are involved in this conflict and what role the United States, Russia, China, and the United Nations have played over the years. We'll also explore how international diplomacy and global politics shape the decisions made by Iran and Israel, and whether there is any real hope for peace in the future. So stay with us as we continue to explore this complex and important issue in simple, easy-to-understand English.
To truly understand the conflict between Iran and Israel, we also need to look at the countries that support each side, because this is not just a local or regional issue. It has grown into a global one, with many powerful nations becoming involved in different ways, depending on their interests, alliances, and views about security, religion, and international power. The actions and decisions of countries like the United States, Russia, China, and the members of the European Union have a big influence on what happens next between Iran and Israel. And in many ways, these outside powers have made the situation more complicated, but also more connected to world politics.
Let's start with the United States, which has been a close ally of Israel since the country was established in 1948 and continues to give it strong military, economic, and diplomatic support today. The U.S. provides Israel with billions of dollars in military aid each year, advanced weapons systems, and political backing at the United Nations, which makes Israel feel confident in standing up to threats from countries like Iran. American leaders from both political parties have promised to protect Israel's security, and they often describe Iran as the greatest threat to peace in the Middle East. Because of this relationship, when Israel feels threatened, it often turns to the United States for help and support.
On the other hand, the relationship between the United States and Iran has been deeply hostile ever since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when the Islamic Republic replaced the pro-Western Shah and a group of students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, holding American diplomats hostage for more than a year. Since then, the two countries have not had formal diplomatic relations, and the United States has placed many economic sanctions on Iran to punish its government for supporting terrorism, violating human rights, and working on its nuclear program. However, there have also been moments when US presidents tried to reduce tensions with Iran, especially during the time of the nuclear deal in 2015.
Meanwhile, Russia has taken a very different position in the region, choosing to support Iran both politically and militarily for its own strategic reasons. Russia and Iran work closely together in places like Syria, where both countries support the government of President Bashar al-Assad in its civil war against rebel groups, some of which were backed by the West. By helping Iran and its allies, Russia is able to increase its influence in the Middle East, push back against US power, and sell weapons and nuclear technology to a friendly government. Russia doesn't see Iran as a major threat like the West does, and this has created a deep partnership that continues to grow stronger.
China also has important ties with Iran, especially in terms of trade, investment, and energy. China buys a lot of oil from Iran and has helped build roads, factories, and technology systems in the country as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, a huge project to connect China with the rest of the world through infrastructure. China often opposes US sanctions against Iran and believes that diplomacy is the best way to solve problems in the Middle East. While China does not take a very strong side in the Iran-Israel conflict, it often supports Iran at the United Nations and wants to keep good relations with all countries in the region, including Israel, because of business and economic goals.
The European Union, made up of countries like France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, also plays an important role and has tried to act as a middle force by promoting peace, dialogue, and agreements. These countries helped create the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran and were very disappointed when the United States pulled out in 2018. They continue to believe that negotiation and diplomacy are the best paths to avoid war, and they have been working hard to bring both Iran and the United States back to the deal. At the same time, most European countries have good relations with Israel and sell it military technology, which puts them in a delicate position between two sides that don't trust each other.
Then there are countries in the Middle East that support either Israel or Iran, depending on their own politics, religious beliefs, and strategic goals. Saudi Arabia, for example, is a powerful Sunni Muslim country that sees Shia-led Iran as a major threat to its influence and has supported actions that limit Iran's power in the region. For many years, Saudi Arabia and Israel did not talk to each other, but now, because they share a common enemy in Iran, they have quietly started cooperating in security matters, and some people believe they might even become official allies in the future. This is a big change in the region and could reshape alliances.
Iran also has its own network of allies and groups that it supports across the Middle East, which it calls the Axis of Resistance. This includes Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, militias in Iraq, and the Houthi rebels in Yemen. These groups all share Iran's opposition to Israel and the United States, and they receive money, weapons, and training from Iran to fight against Western influence. Iran uses these groups as a way to spread its power and pressure Israel without having to go to direct war. This strategy has been very effective in keeping Israel on high alert and forcing it to fight battles on many different fronts at the same time.
What all of this means is that the Iran-Israel conflict is not just a fight between two countries. It is part of a much bigger web of global relationships, military deals, energy needs, and political alliances. The involvement of powerful nations like the United States, Russia, and China makes it much harder to find a simple solution because each of these countries has its own interests and strategies. Some want to avoid war, others want to sell weapons, and a few want to gain more power in the region. As long as these interests remain in conflict, it will be very difficult to bring peace to this part of the world.
In our next section, we will look at how the recent violence between Iran-backed groups and Israel has affected innocent people, especially civilians in places like Gaza, Lebanon, and Israel. We'll talk about how war destroys lives, homes, and dreams, and why many people are calling for peace even when their governments continue to fight. So, don't go anywhere, because this is one of the most emotional and human parts of the story, and it's something the world needs to hear.
When we talk about the conflict between Iran and Israel, it's very important to remember that behind all the politics and military actions, there are millions of innocent people whose lives are directly affected by the violence. Families, children, and ordinary citizens often suffer the most during conflicts, and the ongoing tensions have caused great pain, fear, and destruction for many communities in Israel, Iran, and the surrounding countries. The fighting is not just between armies. It happens in cities and towns where people live, work, and go to school, making the consequences deeply personal and tragic.
One of the most visible and heartbreaking places affected by this conflict is the Gaza Strip, a small piece of land controlled by Hamas, an Iran-backed group that opposes Israel. Gaza has experienced repeated wars and military attacks over the past years, resulting in thousands of deaths and injuries, many of them civilians, including women and children. The infrastructure in Gaza is heavily damaged. Hospitals, schools, homes, and water systems have been destroyed or badly harmed, which makes daily life very difficult for the people living there. Many families live in fear, never knowing when the next conflict will begin or where it might hit.
In Lebanon, another country heavily influenced by Iran through its support for Hezbollah, the situation is similar. Hezbollah has fought several wars with Israel and has large numbers of weapons stored inside civilian areas. This means that when fighting breaks out, civilians often find themselves caught in the crossfire, facing bombings, destruction of homes, and long-lasting economic hardship. The people of Lebanon, already struggling with a severe economic crisis, have to deal with the constant threat of violence, making it difficult to build stable and peaceful lives.
On the Israeli side, civilians also live under constant threat of rocket attacks, bombings, and other forms of violence. Many Israeli cities near the borders with Gaza and Lebanon have experienced attacks that force families to rush to shelters and disrupt normal life. These repeated attacks create a deep sense of insecurity and trauma, especially among children who grow up in fear and uncertainty. The psychological impact of living in a conflict zone for years cannot be overstated, and many people suffer from stress, anxiety, and other mental health issues as a result.
Beyond the direct violence, the ongoing conflict has caused major economic problems for people on all sides. In Gaza, the blockade imposed by Israel and Egypt restricts the movement of goods and people, leading to high unemployment, poverty, and lack of access to essential services like clean water and electricity. In Iran, the economic sanctions and political isolation have made everyday life harder, limiting access to important medicines and basic supplies. Israel, too, spends huge amounts of money on defense and emergency preparedness, which affects its national budget and priorities.
Many humanitarian organizations and international groups try to provide help and support to the affected populations, offering food, medical care, shelter, and education. However, their work is often made difficult by the security situation, political disagreements, and restrictions placed by governments and armed groups. Despite these challenges, volunteers and aid workers continue to risk their lives to bring relief and hope to people caught in the middle of this long-lasting conflict.
The human cost of the Iran-Israel conflict reminds us that the consequences of war are not just political or military. They are deeply personal and affect the most vulnerable members of society. When children lose their homes, families lose loved ones, and communities face destruction, the wounds run deep and take generations to heal. This is why many voices around the world are calling for peace, dialogue, and understanding, hoping that future generations will not have to suffer the same pain.
It's also important to recognize that many people inside Iran, Israel, and the wider region want peace and stability, but they often feel powerless against the decisions made by their governments and military leaders. Ordinary citizens are tired of the violence, the fear, and the uncertainty, and they hope for a future where their children can grow up without the threat of war. These hopes for peace are sometimes overlooked in the headlines, but they represent a powerful desire shared by many.
As listeners, understanding the human cost of this conflict helps us see beyond political arguments and military strategies, reminding us that at the heart of every news story are real people with hopes, dreams, and lives interrupted by violence. This awareness can inspire us to learn more, speak out for peace, and support efforts to reduce suffering wherever conflicts happen in the world.
In the next section, we will explore the recent escalations in violence, including rocket attacks, airstrikes, and border clashes, to help explain how these actions affect the possibility of peace and what could happen next. We will also talk about how the international community responds to these outbreaks of violence and what steps might be taken to prevent future wars.
In recent years, tensions between Iran and Israel have increased dramatically, leading to a series of violent escalations that threaten to push the region into a larger conflict. These escalations often begin with actions such as rocket attacks, airstrikes, or covert operations, and then quickly spiral into cycles of retaliation and counter-retaliation. For example, Iran-backed groups in Gaza or Lebanon may launch rockets into Israeli territory, which Israel responds to with airstrikes targeting militant sites or weapons storage facilities. This back-and-forth violence creates an unstable situation where even a small incident can ignite a much bigger confrontation.
One major concern is that these escalations are not isolated events, but are connected to the broader regional and international conflicts involving Iran's nuclear program, Israel's security concerns, and the alliances we discussed earlier. For instance, when Israel attacks Iranian-backed militias in Syria or Iraq, it aims to prevent Iran from gaining a stronger foothold close to its borders. Iran, in turn, views these attacks as threats to its sovereignty and responds by supporting proxy groups that can strike back. This constant pressure and mistrust make it very difficult for either side to step back and negotiate peace.
The recent escalation cycles have also shown how dangerous the conflict can become for civilians on both sides. Rocket barrages from Gaza and southern Lebanon target Israeli cities and towns, forcing millions to seek shelter and disrupting daily life. Israeli airstrikes aim to destroy militant infrastructure, but often hit residential areas, causing casualties and damage to civilian homes and services. This cycle of violence feeds hatred and fear on both sides, making it harder for peace advocates to gain support and harder for governments to avoid military action.
Another worrying factor is the use of new technology and tactics, such as drones, cyber attacks, and precision missiles, which increase the speed and scale of attacks. These technologies allow both Iran and Israel to strike targets far from the battlefield, increasing the risk of unintended damage or escalation. Cyber attacks, for example, can target critical infrastructure like power grids or communication networks, affecting millions of civilians and causing widespread disruption. The increasing complexity and sophistication of the conflict make it harder to predict and control, raising the stakes for everyone involved.
International reactions to these escalations vary widely, with some countries calling for restraint and dialogue, while others openly support one side or the other. The United Nations often holds emergency meetings to discuss ceasefires and humanitarian aid, but enforcement is limited, and peace agreements tend to be fragile and temporary. Some international players try to broker talks between the conflicting parties, but deep distrust and conflicting demands have so far prevented any lasting solutions. The media coverage also plays a role, as different outlets emphasize different narratives, shaping public opinion around the world.
One of the key challenges to stopping the recent escalations is the lack of direct communication between Iran and Israel. Unlike many conflicts where leaders can talk to de-escalate tensions, these two countries have no formal diplomatic relations and rarely engage in dialogue. Instead, much of the fighting is carried out through proxy groups and covert actions, making it difficult to establish clear lines of communication or negotiate ceasefires. This absence of dialogue keeps misunderstandings and suspicions high, increasing the chances of accidental or intentional escalation.
Despite these challenges, there are ongoing efforts by some governments, international organizations, and civil society groups to reduce violence and encourage dialogue. Track 2 diplomacy, which involves unofficial talks between experts and activists, has helped open some channels of communication and build trust. Humanitarian organizations also work to protect civilians and provide aid during escalations. While these efforts have not yet led to a comprehensive peace agreement, they demonstrate that many people are committed to finding a better way forward, even in the face of conflict.
In summary, the recent escalations between Iran and Israel are dangerous and complex, fueled by deep-rooted mistrust, regional rivalries, and the involvement of multiple actors. The violence disrupts millions of lives and threatens to spread further if not managed carefully. Understanding these escalations helps us see why peace is so difficult to achieve and why the international community must continue to push for dialogue, restraint, and long-term solutions.
Next, we will discuss possible paths toward peace and what changes might help reduce tensions in the future. We'll explore different ideas, including diplomacy, economic cooperation, and people-to-people exchanges, to imagine a world where Iran and Israel can coexist without violence. Stay tuned for this hopeful and important conversation. When we look at the decades of conflict between Iran and Israel, it's clear that the situation is deeply complicated. But many experts and peace advocates believe that peace is possible if both sides and the international community work together sincerely. One of the first and most important steps toward peace is opening communication channels, even if informal, to reduce misunderstandings and build trust. Without communication, each side relies on assumptions and fears that fuel hostility and violence. Track 2 diplomacy, which involves unofficial dialogues between academics, religious leaders, and civil society representatives, has shown some promise. These talks, while not official, help create spaces where people can discuss difficult issues honestly and explore common ground, even if political leaders remain unwilling or unable to negotiate directly.
Beyond dialogue, economic cooperation is often suggested as a powerful tool for peace. History shows that countries with strong trade ties and economic interdependence are less likely to go to war because the cost of conflict is too high. If Iran and Israel, or their regional neighbors, could find ways to cooperate economically, it might build incentives to reduce tensions. For example, shared interests in energy, water management, and technology could provide a foundation for collaboration. However, the current political climate and sanctions make such cooperation extremely difficult. Still, some hopeful signs exist, such as indirect trade and business contacts through third countries, showing that economic interests can sometimes transcend politics and create openings for peace.
Another key path to peace involves the role of international organizations and third-party mediators who can help facilitate negotiations, provide guarantees for agreements, and monitor compliance. The United Nations, the European Union, and countries like Switzerland and Norway have historically played important roles in mediating conflicts around the world. In the Iran-Israel case, a neutral mediator could help bridge gaps by organizing peace talks that include not only the governments but also representatives from different communities affected by the conflict. Such inclusive negotiations can help address underlying grievances and build a broader consensus for peace, rather than agreements imposed only by political elites.
People-to-people initiatives are another hopeful avenue. Often, ordinary citizens on both sides have little contact with each other and only hear negative stories about the enemy. Programs that encourage cultural exchanges, joint educational projects, and dialogue between communities can help break down stereotypes and humanize those seen as adversaries. These efforts don't solve political problems overnight, but they create a foundation of mutual understanding and empathy, which is crucial for long-term peace. Youth engagement is especially important as young people represent the future and can be powerful agents of change when given opportunities to connect across divides.
Importantly, peace efforts must also address the security concerns of both Iran and Israel. Israel fears attacks from Iran or its proxy groups, while Iran worries about Israeli military power and perceived threats to its sovereignty. Any peace process needs to find ways to guarantee the safety and security of all parties. Confidence-building measures such as arms control agreements, transparency in military activities, and demilitarized zones could help reduce fears and lower the risk of accidental conflict. Without addressing these security dilemmas, mistrust will remain high, making lasting peace unlikely.
The role of public opinion is critical as well. In both Iran and Israel, many people remain skeptical about peace due to years of conflict and propaganda. Peace initiatives need to be supported by education and media that promote dialogue, respect for human rights, and the benefits of peaceful coexistence. Governments and civil society organizations can work together to build a culture of peace, encouraging people to reject hatred and violence. This shift in mindset is challenging but essential because peace cannot be imposed from above. It must be supported by the people who live in these societies.
Finally, we cannot ignore the broader regional and international context. The Iran-Israel conflict is part of a larger Middle Eastern puzzle involving many countries with competing interests and alliances. For peace to be sustainable, regional cooperation and support are necessary. This means engaging neighboring countries in peace efforts, addressing related conflicts, and promoting economic development and stability across the region. International powers like the United States, Russia, China, and the European Union also have important roles in encouraging dialogue and providing incentives for peace. Their involvement must be balanced and focused on supporting a fair and just resolution, rather than exacerbating divisions.
In summary, while the path to peace between Iran and Israel is challenging and filled with obstacles, many avenues exist that could help reduce tensions and eventually bring an end to decades of conflict. Open communication, economic cooperation, mediation by neutral parties, grassroots dialogue, addressing security concerns, public support for peace, and regional and international cooperation all play essential roles. Achieving peace will require patience, courage, and the willingness of many different actors to come together with a shared vision of a safer, more peaceful future.
In our final section, we will look at what the future might hold for this conflict, possible scenarios, ongoing risks, and the importance of staying informed and hopeful. Understanding the situation fully helps us engage as global citizens who care about peace and justice around the world. Stay with us for this important conclusion. When discussing the conflict between Iran and Israel, it is crucial to go beyond the political rhetoric and military strategies to truly understand the devastating humanitarian consequences that ripple across the region, affecting millions of innocent lives in profound and lasting ways. The human cost of this conflict is immense and multifaceted, stretching far beyond the battlefield into the everyday realities of families, children, and communities who face the constant threat of violence, displacement, and severe economic hardship. In areas directly affected by hostilities, civilians live under the shadow of fear, with their safety and basic human rights often compromised as infrastructure is destroyed, healthcare systems collapse, and access to education becomes limited or impossible. The psychological toll is equally alarming, with trauma and mental health crises sweeping through populations forced to endure repeated cycles of conflict, loss, and uncertainty. These humanitarian issues are not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern that perpetuates suffering and undermines prospects for peace and development.
In examining the humanitarian dimension of the Iran-Israel conflict, it is important to recognize that the impact extends well beyond the borders of these two nations, encompassing neighboring countries such as Lebanon, Syria, and the Gaza Strip, where proxy groups aligned with Iran frequently clash with Israeli forces. This regional spillover amplifies the human suffering, as entire populations in these zones live under constant threat of violence, with many forced to flee their homes and seek refuge in overcrowded camps or precarious living conditions. The displacement of civilians not only disrupts their lives, but also creates long-term challenges for host countries and international humanitarian agencies struggling to provide sufficient food, clean water, medical care, and shelter. Refugees often endure years or even decades in limbo, lacking the stability necessary for rebuilding their lives or contributing productively to society. This protracted displacement exacerbates poverty, hinders access to education, and increases vulnerability to exploitation and abuse, especially among women and children.
Another severe consequence of the ongoing conflict is the destruction and degradation of essential infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, water treatment facilities, and power plants, which are frequently targeted or damaged during military operations. The destruction of healthcare infrastructure has particularly devastating effects, as it not only limits the ability to treat injuries caused by violence, but also hampers the management of chronic diseases, maternal and child health, and vaccination programs. In many conflict-affected areas, hospitals operate at reduced capacity or are forced to close altogether, leaving vulnerable populations without access to vital services. Similarly, damage to schools interrupts education for thousands of children, depriving them of stability and hope for the future. The disruption of water and electricity supplies further compounds daily hardships, contributing to poor sanitation and increasing the risk of disease outbreaks. Rebuilding this infrastructure requires significant time and resources, which are often scarce due to ongoing insecurity and political challenges.
Economically, the conflict exacerbates hardship by destroying businesses, disrupting markets, and limiting employment opportunities. In Israel and Iran alike, economic sanctions, military expenditures, and instability reduce investment and growth prospects, leading to high unemployment rates and declining living standards. For many families, the loss of income and rising costs of basic goods push them into poverty, increasing food insecurity and limiting access to healthcare and education. The economic impact is especially harsh on youth, who face a bleak job market and limited opportunities, which can foster frustration, hopelessness, and, in some cases, radicalization or participation in armed groups. Women and marginalized communities often bear a disproportionate share of these economic burdens, facing barriers to employment and social services that deepen existing inequalities.
Beyond the physical and economic hardships, the psychological and emotional toll on individuals and communities cannot be overstated. Prolonged exposure to violence, displacement, and uncertainty leads to high rates of trauma, anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Children growing up in conflict zones are especially vulnerable, as their developing minds absorb the constant stress and fear, affecting their cognitive, emotional, and social development. This trauma often remains unaddressed due to limited mental health services, stigma, and the overwhelming scale of need. The cumulative effect of these psychological wounds is profound, creating cycles of suffering that can last generations and hinder reconciliation efforts by perpetuating fear, mistrust, and hatred between communities. Healing this psychological damage requires comprehensive, long-term programs that integrate mental health care with community support and peace-building initiatives.
Humanitarian organizations and international agencies play a critical role in mitigating these impacts by providing emergency relief, medical care, shelter, and psychosocial support to affected populations. However, their efforts face significant challenges, including restricted access due to ongoing fighting, bureaucratic obstacles, and security risks for aid workers. Ceasefires and humanitarian pauses in conflict are vital to enable aid delivery and allow vulnerable populations to receive assistance. The protection of civilians and respect for international humanitarian law, which mandates the safeguarding of non-combatants and humanitarian personnel during conflicts, are essential to reducing suffering. Unfortunately, violations of these laws are common in protracted conflicts, leading to further harm and complicating efforts to address humanitarian needs.
International support and pressure can be pivotal in encouraging all parties to uphold humanitarian principles and facilitate aid access. Public awareness campaigns, advocacy by human rights organizations, and diplomatic efforts are necessary to highlight violations and demand accountability. Furthermore, rebuilding trust between communities through grassroots initiatives such as interfaith dialogues, cultural exchanges, and joint reconstruction projects can help address some of the deeper wounds caused by conflict and foster social cohesion. These peace-building efforts complement humanitarian aid by creating environments where recovery and reconciliation become possible.
Finally, it is essential to view the humanitarian impact not as a side issue, but as central to any efforts aimed at resolving the Iran-Israel conflict. Addressing human suffering and protecting civilian lives must be priorities alongside political negotiations and security concerns. Without a focus on the human dimension, peace agreements risk ignoring the needs and rights of those most affected by the conflict, leading to fragile solutions that fail to deliver lasting stability. By prioritizing humanitarian protection, supporting recovery and development, and promoting justice and reconciliation, the international community and regional actors can contribute to breaking the cycle of violence and building a more hopeful future for all people in the region.
Understanding the human cost reminds us why this conflict matters deeply, not only in terms of geopolitics, but in terms of real people's lives. Behind every headline are mothers, fathers, children, doctors, teachers, and countless others whose hopes, dreams, and futures hang in the balance. As global citizens, it is our responsibility to stay informed, advocate for peace, and support efforts that alleviate suffering and build bridges toward understanding and coexistence. In doing so, we honor the shared humanity that connects us all, even in the most divided regions of the world.
As we come to the final part of our discussion, it's important to look ahead and think about what the future might hold for the ongoing conflict between Iran and Israel. The truth is, there are several possible scenarios, ranging from a continued cycle of violence and tension to a hopeful resolution based on diplomacy and mutual understanding. Unfortunately, without changes in policy, leadership, or significant external pressure, the risk remains high that the conflict will persist or even escalate. However, it's equally important to remember that history has shown us that long-standing conflicts can be resolved through persistent effort, dialogue, and sometimes unexpected breakthroughs.
One scenario that worries many experts is the possibility of a wider regional war. Because Iran supports various militias and proxy groups in neighboring countries like Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza, any significant escalation could draw multiple actors into the conflict. This would not only worsen the humanitarian crisis, but also destabilize the entire Middle East and affect global security, including the flow of energy resources that impact the world economy. On the other hand, international diplomatic efforts and pressure could prevent such a scenario if all parties see that escalation is too costly and counterproductive.
Another potential outcome is a prolonged stalemate, where neither side can achieve a decisive victory or peaceful agreement. This would mean living with ongoing skirmishes, cyber attacks, espionage, and a tense military buildup, with frequent flare-ups that disrupt lives and economies but don't resolve the core issues. While this scenario may seem bleak, it could also create an environment where peace negotiations remain possible, as both sides might eventually seek a way to reduce costs and find compromises.
A more optimistic future involves gradual steps toward peace, such as small-scale agreements on specific issues, like prisoner exchanges, ceasefires, or economic cooperation, that build trust and pave the way for broader dialogue. These steps require courageous leadership willing to take political risks and engage with the other side. Grassroots peace movements and international diplomacy would play critical roles in supporting these efforts. Over time, such incremental progress could lead to formal peace talks and a more stable relationship.
Whatever the future holds, it's crucial for people around the world to stay informed and engaged. Understanding the history, causes, and human impact of the Iran-Israel conflict helps us become better global citizens. Awareness can also lead to support for peaceful solutions, humanitarian aid, and pressure on leaders to prioritize diplomacy over violence. Media literacy is important too, as coverage of the conflict can sometimes be biased or incomplete. Seeking balanced information and listening to diverse perspectives can help build empathy and understanding.
Finally, while the conflict may seem distant to many, its consequences affect millions of lives, including those of refugees, families living in fear, and children growing up amid violence. Supporting peace efforts and humanitarian work, even in small ways, contributes to a more hopeful future. We all share a responsibility to promote dialogue, respect human rights, and stand against hatred and violence wherever it occurs.
Thank you for joining us on this deep and important exploration of what's happening between Iran and Israel. We hope this podcast has helped you understand the complexities and human stories behind the headlines. Remember, peace is possible, but it requires effort from all sides and the support of the global community.
If you want to learn more about international issues and improve your English along the way, don't forget to check out our other episodes here at the English Globe. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning. Take care.